This webinar is organized by Polonia Institute with the help of Coalition of Polish Americans. And this webinar is made possible thanks to the financial support of the Chancellor of Prime Minister of Poland as part of the Polonia and Poles Abroad 2023 program entitled Great Polish Family Together on Behalf of Poland. On September 1st, 1939, World War II began when Germany attacked Poland from the west, north, and south. In 17 days, another bloodthirsty neighbor attacked Poland from the east. Polish army fought bravely, but it was no match against both Germany and Soviet Union, acting in unison according to the infamous Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. The subsequent occupation of Poland has brought unspeakable mayhem to Polish people. In today's webinar, we'll be talking about the unpunished crimes by Germany against ethnic Poles during World War II. This subject is not being talked about in mainstream media, is not being shown in big Hollywood movies, is not popular with university professors. But in today's webinar, we'll present a few people who do talk and write about it. We are joined by four, actually maybe three, now we have three, but four panelists. Okay, let me see. Okay, we have four panelists, so we have everybody. So Dr. Paweł Pońsko, co-author of the official report on Polish war losses caused by Nazi Germany in World War II. We have Dr. John Guzłowski, poet and author of Echoes of Tattered Tongues, Memory Unfolded. We have Dr. Maria Schroeder-Winienda, attorney and author of the book Danuta Growing Up Between Katyn and Auschwitz. And we have Stephen Gilbride, who will present the story of his late mother, Bożena Urbanowicz-Gilbride, based on two books, Children of Terror and Waiting for Mama. I wanted to warmly thank our panelists for participating in this webinar. Okay, we are ready to begin. People are still joining. I see on the Zoom platform, we expect close to 100 viewers. We don't have that much yet, but hopefully they'll join. And we have also several people here with us in Los Angeles. The people here will help to introduce our panelists and also will perform necessary technical functions. But we'll start. We have a special guest here in Los Angeles. It is the Deputy Consul of Poland in Los Angeles, Mr. Mateusz Gmura. I would like him to say a few words.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I take it as a pleasure to be here, to be a part as a guest, not a panelist, but a guest of today's webinar, which I find most crucial in communicating and addressing the issue of reparations. So thank you for having me, first of all, and I would just like to briefly introduce and sketch why we're meeting here and why it is very important to be able to communicate and to educate about the reparations. So starting from the resolution which was made by the Council of Ministers of the Republic of Poland in April, when the Council introduced the resolution which necessitated the way to regulate the relations between Poland and Germany in settling the reparations. The resolution actually closed any disputes that have been around for a very, very long time. Many unjustified claims about, claims that Poland seemingly renounced reparations or was given. So the resolution luckily clarifies that there is no such a thing, and neither in the times of the People's Republic of Poland or in the times of the sovereign Poland, and neither the Polish government or the German government, neither of them actually closed the matter of reparations, some redemption or compensation. So it is still an open case. Neither Poland Poland has never renounced the need to be redeemed for the losses during the World and 45. I take special pleasure because I'm representing Consul General of the Republic of Poland in LA, which is actually representing Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland, and I'm glad to you will have an opportunity to learn in detail. But so this name will show up definitely several times here. But I'm especially glad that the government plenipotentiary for the compensation of damages caused by the German aggression and occupation in 1939 and 45 is Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Arkadiusz Mularczyk. And I'm specifically and especially glad that I might be representing today. I think that this just a matter of universal truth to be able to communicate the fact that the losses that Poland sustained during the Second World War from both aggressors, actually Germany and Russia, in between those 6 years, actually from Russia afterwards, after 45 too, that struggle continued. But I'm especially glad that we're going to have experts, professors, lawyers, historians, scholars in general, people who know this subject, who have prepared the official report of the losses. So I'm especially glad and open to listening, learning always something a little bit more as a child and grandchild of Polish uprisers and forced labor workers. I still think it is worth communicating, and it is actually essential. We go two ways with communicating the problem of reparations. Like one is trying to find a dialogue, trying to find a platform to be able to communicate that the necessity of reparations to the government of Germany. Secondly, panels like this today are a wonderful platform to be able to communicate and to educate, because what was pretty obvious to my generation of the 1970s and those generations who came before me is not necessarily obvious, historically speaking, is not necessarily obvious to the generations of my children and the ones who are coming up soon. So we have to be able to communicate historical truth the way it was, because we owe that to the people who suffered unexcused hurts. So one last thing that I wanted to stress, it might be a little bit easier for our viewers who are not accustomed to it, I mean, on a regular basis with the topic of Polish reparations, just to be able to show you the way what's going to happen to the people who suffered losses, who were deprived of their material goods, of the sometimes their lives, I mean, in numerous cases, their lives were taken. If you take into account the Russian aggression of Ukraine that is still going on, and you want to wonder what's going to happen to those Ukrainian people who suffered but did not deserve being attacked by this Russian aggressor, you might come to think what the situation of Poland, the greatest suffering country of the Second World War, was. And if we do not redeem, how can we be able to speak and educate our future generations? So it is our duty, and I take immense pleasure to listen to the experts that are going to speak, and the panelist experts that are going to present the problematics of the reparations in today's webinar. So I'm especially grateful to Polonia Institute for having me. I would like to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland. I would also like to thank the Chancellery of the Prime Minister, as I hear from, because these webinars are being organized with a sufficient support of the Chancellery of the Prime Minister. So thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'll be staying with you because I really want to expand my knowledge about the reparations. So thank you very much also to the panelists. So I look forward to a very fruitful session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Consul. We appreciate your presence here. And now we invite our first speaker, Dr. Paweł Pońsko.
Hello, good morning. It's a great honor for me that I can speak about the reparations and present the topic and partly at least our report that we prepared and published a year ago to the audience in USA. If I could, I don't know if I'm able to show the presentation, because I have a presentation that talks about the economic cost of war on the example of Poland during the Second World War. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so please let me talk about this. And I'm an author and co-author of two chapters in the report of the losses. One thing that I wanted to say at the very beginning, there is a question that comes up quite often when we talk to audience, to people, why so late the report, and isn't it too late to publish the report? So obviously the answer is that it's never too late to educate people and to show the real damage that we have, that Poland incurred, and to talk about the truth about the Second World War. And hopefully this Germany focus economic debt towards Poland after the damages they caused during the Second World War. So this is these are the losses that were computed in the report. As you can see, 76, almost 77% of those losses are the demographic losses. And there is something that I need to explain at this point. The report computes only the losses which were caused by German occupation on the old Polish lands when Germany invaded Poland. And it is documented that in this part of Poland, and during only the German occupation, there was more than 5.2 million people murdered by Germans. And then somebody can ask the question, so, okay, how is it possible to talk about the money value of human loss? Well, on first thing, on the moral grounds, that's quite difficult to talk about this, since we are not able to repay and the life of somebody, or the life of a close person, of a father or mother of a family, obviously. But then in economics nowadays, we have such a general measure of welfare, which is called GDP. And if we can use the national accounts and be able to refer the human losses, represent them in terms of the GDP or the contribution of these people to the GDP, then it is consistent with the economic theory, and at least shows part of the value of the human losses in terms of how much these people would be able to produce welfare as a labor force if they were allowed to live, or if they were allowed to be healthy and to work. And the number you see here is exactly this is the way it is computed. So this is the contribution to the GDP that people who were murdered during the Second World War by Germans, they would have. And there are material losses, which is the buildings, the movable capital. There is some other parts of those losses are pointed out separately, because the big difference is that there are some certain characteristics of losses which we would like to, which we can use to actually compute or estimate their values. So, for instance, one thing is the artistic heritage, all the paintings, all the cultural heritage of Poland, because the estimation of value of objects which cannot be now sold because we cannot find them. They are somewhere stolen by the Germans and Austrians. And we don't know their market value, has to be estimated in a way that, there is some formulas which try to at least, estimate the value of the artistic heritage. On the other hand, on the banking sector, the numbers are very clear, and this is actually the easiest in terms of mathematics, the easiest part of collecting the data, because everything is written in the documents. The sum of the money is written on the document, so you can basically say how much it would be worth today, right? The same with the insurance companies. That's exactly the same story. So now, There is one thing that that is also important to mention is this, that you have to remember, and everybody knows this, that money has a time value, which is that the purchasing power of dollar is changing over time, and obviously that also happens with any other currency, and that happened also with the Polish zloty. So we had to compute this in the Polish zloty for 1938, 1939. I'm pointing out these two years because actually the level of prices in Poland at that time were the same. So this does not change much, but then we had to bring this value to the present times. And since the report was published last year, then the number you see, the 6,220 6,220 billion zloty is the current amount of Polish zloty for at the end of 2021. And obviously the number changes over time. So every year we have to update the number. That's how this is computed. Now I will return to this at the end of the presentation. Now there is several things that I would like to mention, and something that what was my expertise is the economic approach to compute the war losses. There are two things that we think when we think about the economic cost of war. First of all, these are the direct losses, and then there are the indirect losses, which have a huge impact on the welfare of the society. So the direct losses is pretty simple. We know that how many people were murdered, how many buildings were demolished, etc. These are the direct losses. But the indirect losses are all those people who were not born because some of the people were murdered. These are all the connections or the ties, economic ties with other countries, with allies, and the international trade that could not happen, and the technology that Poland would acquire from France or England as Polish allies at the beginning of the Second World War, which Poland did not, so Poland couldn't, as quickly as it should, develop economically after the war. So the indirect losses is a much broader and actually a very big part of the losses that we want to compute. So there are several papers I mentioned here just to show you that the present economic research is really focused on this. And actually lately, since we have a lot more tools, economic tools nowadays to try to estimate those losses, there's a lot of really good research showing up. And the war with Ukraine, I'm a little bit jealous in the sense that the Ukrainians have much better access to data to be able to more precisely estimate the losses they are suffering now during their war. We have to use the historical data. And this is what I said about the direct economic costs and indirect economic costs. And let me go to the GDP. So when we think about the macro approach and try to accumulate all those economic losses and represent them in this GDP, which is the kind of aggregate number of or aggregate expression of welfare the economy can produce, one thing I have to mention for those who didn't study economics is that GDP is a stream. It's not a stock, which means that every single year we produce this GDP and we share it as our income so we can use it for our consumption. And every year we try to produce more. That's what we understand by economic growth. And this shows that our level of living, our consumption is increasing exactly with the economic growth. So what we can do, if we can see the economic tools nowadays tell us that if we can show what would be the counterfactual level of GDP, so this is the level which what would happen if the war did not happen, and then we can compute what happened to the GDP during the war, then the output gap, the difference, is the welfare that was not produced during the war, and that's the loss in terms of the level of living, the economic level of living of the society due to the occupation, like for instance in Poland, in German occupation. So the method I had to use, it had to be tailored to the availability of the data, because remember that's 8 years, and we don't have very exact data, so we needed to dig a little bit and to make sure that the data is correct. What I'm showing you here, that's probably not very interesting for many people. These are some formulas. What I'm trying to show on this slide is that it's exactly the same method which nowadays IMF, World Bank, OECD, all those organizations use to estimate what is the economic potential of every country. So there is nothing, there was my purpose to use the most common and most widely used methodology, so nobody would ever question them, the economic methodology that I use. And now when you look at this, these are the data about the GDP in Poland before the Second World War. For those who don't know economic Polish history, then before the Second World War, we had several really good economists, and one of them, Michał Kalecki, was actually famous all over the world. Many people point to the fact that actually the theory which John Maynard Keynes became famous of was previously written by Michał Kalecki, but it wasn't published in English papers, so that's why it wasn't very well popularized. So we are very fortunate in this case, because those guys actually did also in their research estimates of Polish GDP before the Second World War. Then the measure at that time wasn't very popular yet, but there are several time series. Some of them are called differently, like for instance, the income generated according to the Polish Academy of Science, and then thankfully there is a description of the definition they use. This description is actually quite far away from what we understand by GDP. So this, for instance, this one full series wasn't very useful, but there are several other series which were useful, which we can adapt. There is, for those who are interested in this kind of research, there is in Groningen in Holland, there is an institute which produces research on estimates on the historical GDP data and GDP growth. This is Madison Institute and Madison database. This is how it is called. So I also use those because these are the data which are available to everybody. Everybody can check if what we did here is correct. And then based on those, this data, this is the history of Polish development before the Second World War. So you can see there is the 1929, then there is the Great Crisis when Poland also suffered during this Great Crisis. And then there is a moment where Polish government sets up very big investments. One of those investments is a harbor in Gdynia. The other of those investments is so-called the Central Industrial region in Silesia. And this part, the very quick growth, economic growth, is partly due to those big investments that Poland made after the crisis was over. So 2 years, for the 2-year period before the Second World War, Poland was developing with the speed of more than 10% of GDP growth year over year, and was a country which was on a path to actually really rebuild finally after the long period of life. So before the First World War, when Poland was occupied by our beloved free neighbors. So, so we have the history before. Now what we could do, we can try to use the data and see what happened to the productive capital, which is all the capital that can be used to actually generate welfare. What happens to the labor? What happens to the technology, which gives us the productivity of the capital and labor, and then estimate what happens to the GDP, which is the welfare produced. So now you can see that there are two different scenarios. This is because just for the scientific preciseness, if I can use this word, if that's a word at all. I was trying to use the data all the way I could do to make sure that we show a scenario which is actually to the historical facts. So these are the two possible scenarios for the accumulation of productive capital. The labor was the easy part because there is a lot of data in the old statistical books. So I could be very precise about this. There was no problem with estimating the level of labor force. One thing that was difficult for us at that point was the level of unemployment, but there is yet another publication by Brian Mitchell, and this gives very good and convincing estimates of the unemployment rate in Poland in the pre-war period. So that's why when they published the number 8.8% for the last year before the war, I used this as the constant for the rest of the computation. These are the numbers that we needed to reproduce the GDP growth. This is in 18 billion of Polish zloty, which is 1938. The TFP, which is the solo residual, if somebody is economically, if somebody knows how to do this in economics, then this is the residual, the rest, which tells us the story about the level of technical development of the country. And then what we do, we build the counterfactual scenarios. The counterfactual scenario could be simply the average growth of the pre-war period, or this could be computed with the production function, which I showed you before, using the production factors and the projection of those production factors. These are two such counterfactual scenarios on average. And they gave us, we used the most common to use, this is 2.07% of GDP growth year by year. Why is it so? Because when you look at this graph, then if I will take average of those GDP numbers, which is the green line, then on average for these 10 years, there was slightly above 2% GDP growth. And this gives us the counterfactual scenarios in numbers. Then we need to build a wartime scenario. The wartime scenario has to be built exactly according to the data that we had about the losses Poland incurred. And then I use the data from the previous chapters, because this is the chapter number 8 of the report. So out of the people who were murdered or who were disabled, we have to take those people who were in the years, the productive years, those people who would actually be active in the labor market. Then with the assumption of the constant unemployment rate, we could assume how much of the labor force would be subtracted due to the murders Germans committed. And then thanks to the research that the Bureau of War Losses in 1947, there was such a bureau which estimated the Polish losses after the Second World War, 2 years after it ended. They gave the number on how much of the productive capital was lost. I was able to reproduce what happened to the productive capital. Then when you build those scenarios in numbers, then you can see that the GDP growth from 18 billion drops to 8 billion just due to the fact that Poland lost its production inputs due to the German occupation. So if we want to show it on the graph, then you can see that this is what would happen in such a very moderate counterfactual scenario, which is the red line, and this is in terms of the labor force. This is what happened to the labor force according to the computed loss of people who were murdered by the Germans. And then if we do the same exercise, but with the GDP, then you can see that this is the story of the GDP, and this would be the counterfactual scenario of the very moderate growth over the period of war. And this is the wartime scenario when we subtracted all those production factors. And then the gap is here in between these two scenarios. This is what is in economics called the output gap, shows that Poland, due to the German devastation of our country, we lost about 54% of our economic potential, which is also the 54% of the potential to generate welfare, and to use this welfare in everyday life. So that's what the research gives us. There is one more thing that I need to tell, because nowadays when we use the contemporary models and methods in economics, actually, those methods were never prepared for the situation when the whole country is occupied and everything in this country, including the institutions, are taken by the aggressor. So in a sense, the assumption in this research shows that all the rest of the GDP, which wasn't lost, should normally belong to the Polish people, and Poles should enjoy over the period of Second World War. But in the case of the Second World War in Poland, it wasn't true, because we have to remember that even though there was some GDP generated out of those production inputs, then a lot of this welfare generated did not go back to Poland. Germans used, for instance, precisely and purposely made inflationary measures to lower the purchasing power of the money Polish people could use over the Second World War. Also, the Polish people had to work as slave workers in the factories to produce, for instance, ammunition for Germany, and it never went into Polish citizens back, so they could use actually this welfare. This actually was used by the Germans. So in this regard, and that's a very important caveat of this kind of research, is that it doesn't show really how much Polish citizens lost. It is only application of a modern economic technique to try to estimate the loss of the potential. And this is the integral over the output gap. So I used many scenarios. The truth is that I'm showing here only two, but just for the curiosity, I did more of the research for myself. So all this is quite close estimate of this is how many billion Polish zloty was lost during the Second World War, according to this research. And so why is it so important? Because that's what I was talking about, the minimum level of the output gap, and why I started talking with the indirect losses, but in the indirect costs, because that's very important to understand that if the war ends as it did in 1945, and now Polish people have to rebuild their country, then they are left with the leftovers of the economy, and they have to live on this and build on this, meaning that for the many years afterwards, the whole Polish society had to live on a much lower level of economic development that it would be able to if the war did not happen. And for those who remember a little bit from history, you know that since after the war, and due to the fact that Germany invaded Poland, we fell behind the so-called Iron Curtain. We also did not receive the money from the Marshall Plan, so we weren't able to sort of fill the gap of the productive capital in our country. And that means that when you look at the country which stayed behind the Iron Curtain, was developing in a slower way than countries, the free market economies, due to the fact that the central economy was much less efficient. And then it started from a level which is 54% lower than it would if the war did not happen. Then we have two generations of Polish people who lived on an economic level which was half lower than they actually should be living, right? That's very important. And the economic level of living, it's not only the amount of food that you can buy, but that's the quality of shoes that you wear, and the quality of healthcare, etc. So two generations of Poland, in fact, felt the indirect cost of the Second World War and the German occupation. So that's very important, and that's the output gap I was trying to show. I don't know if that's interesting, but as a scientist now, I need to check my estimates. So these are different parametrizations of the function, and it shows that the different parametrizations give very, very small slight differences in the numbers. So it is actually pretty robust estimate. This is the final number, and this is for the end of 2021. This is the number in euro. This is the number in American dollars. If I can say, if I'm not taking too much time, I don't know if I am, please let me know. But just one more thing that I wanted to say, because if we are close to the economic theory and we want to be true to the economic theory, then the economic cost really is computed based on the alternative cost, which is the cost of the foregone opportunities. And now the question is it correct to index the losses of the Second World War with the inflation of the USD or American dollar, as we did, and this is the number how we obtain it? Because what it says is that the inflation of the US dollar, the CPI inflation, measures the cost of the consumption basket. Okay, it is upgraded over time with the changes of the basket people actually buy on everyday basis, but it only takes into account the consumption goods. But when you think about this, the Germans took over the whole country. The ownership of the companies, of the factories, of the homes, they threw away a lot of people from homes, for instance, right? Of the institutions of the country. Then the alternative cost that Polish people lost during the Second World War is not only the consumption that they lost, it's not only the iron or the bicycle they couldn't buy to their children, but it is the whole means of sustaining the life of the family, the whole income of the family taking into account their savings, not only the consumption, and in fact, the whole country in terms of the education system, the post office, everything that happened. And then if you think about this, and you think of the alternative cost as the cost of the GDP per capita, so how much of the whole country's welfare, is a part of one person in this country, then we should index this number, this historical number, not by 15, not multiplied by 15 times as we did, but we should multiply it by 132 times. And that would be the proper computation of the alternative cost of the losses of Polish people during the Second World War, if we take account the loss of the whole country, the ownership of the country and everything the country provided for me. And then it wouldn't be 6 billion, it would be 53 trillion Polish zloty. Okay, that's how huge those losses were. In fact, that's what takes into account the proper alternative cost of the losses of Polish people. So now when somebody says that, oh, Poland costs such a huge number and how Germany is supposed to pay, I would say, if you understand economics well, this number is a very big time promotion for Germany, really, because it doesn't show the severity of the occupation of Poland. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pońsko. Please mute yourself. And now our second speaker will be introduced by Chris.
Hi, my name is Krzysztof Pawlik, and this morning I have the distinguished opportunity to introduce you to author, poet, and professor Dr. John Kozlowski. Born in a refugee camp in Germany after World War II, the parents who had been Polish slave laborers in Nazi Germany during the war, Dr. Kozlowski came to America with his family as a displaced person in 1951. He grew up in the tough immigrant neighborhoods of Chicago, where he learned of the shared struggles of fellow immigrants and survivors. For over 50 years, Dr. Kozlowski has written in a wide range of genres about the Polish Catholic experience of World War II and about Polish displaced persons who relocated to the United States after the war. Some of his most well-known works and collections of poems include The Language of Mules, Lightning and Ashes, Third Winter of War, Buchenwald, Echoes of Tattered Tongues, True Confessions, Small Talk, and many others. As a winner of numerous American, Polish, and international poetry awards, as well as a nominee for the Pulitzer Prize and Pushcart Prize, he is recognized by many as one of the most accomplished Polish-American poets on the contemporary scene. With a master's and PhD in English from Purdue University, he joins us today to share his unique perspective on our webinar's topic, the German extermination of ethnic Poles during World War II. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me here. I'm going to read some two pieces of prose and some poems about my parents and their experiences in the war. But first, I'd like to say something about reparations. My mother received reparations from the German government. She received about $30 a month, and she used to say, "They killed my mother, they killed my sister, and they killed my sister's baby, and all they gave me was $30 a month." Uh, I want to begin by reading a prose piece. It's about the beginning of the war, and it's about how the memories of war stay with us. It's called September 1st, 1939, the day World War II began. When you read about history in the history books, it's also clear. The numbers make it seem that way. Numbers, people say, don't lie. A thing begins on a certain day and it ends on another particular date. You see the beginning of a thing and you see its end. It all seems neat and clean, but it isn't really. The history books, for instance, tell us that World War II began on September 1st, 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland from the west. And the same books tell us that the war in Europe ended almost 6 years later on VE Day, May 8th, 1945. My father, Jan Guzowski, was not a student of history. He never had any kind of formal education, never went to school, never could read much beyond what he could read out of a prayer book. But my father knew history. He had lived through history. He was only 19 years old, working on his uncle's farm in Poland when the Germans invaded and turned his whole world upside down. I guess you can say he learned history from the ground up. He was captured by the Germans in a roundup in 1940 and sent to Germany. Like 12 million other slave laborers, he spent the next 5 years at hard labor in concentration and slave labor camps. But for him, the war didn't end when his camp was liberated sometime at the end of March in 1945. And it didn't end on Victory in Europe Day, May 8th, 1945. And it certainly didn't end when my family finally came to America as refugees, displaced persons, DPs, in June of 1951. The war was always with him, and with my mother, Tekla Guzlowski, too, a woman who spent 3 years in the slave labor camps in Germany, and before that had seen the other women in her family murdered and raped by the Germans. The trauma of what she had seen never left her. When I was growing up, I could see it in her eyes and the way she held herself together. My parents carried with them the pain of war and its nightmares every day of their lives. In 1997, 52 years after the war ended, when my father was dying in a hospice, there were times when he was sure that the doctors and nurses trying to comfort him were just German guards who beat him and blinded him in the concentration camp. There were also times when he couldn't recognize me and my mother. He looked at us and was frightened. He thought we were there to torture him. In 2005, toward the end of my mother's life, I told her I was going to be giving a poetry reading and that I would be reading poems about her and my dad and their experiences in the war. I asked her if there was something she wanted me to say to the people in the audience. She said yes. She said, "Tell them that we were not the only ones in the camps." My parents knew that the war had always been with them, teaching them the hard lessons, teaching them how to suffer grief and pain, how to be patient, how to live without hope or bread, how to survive what would kill a person in the normal course of his life. The war taught them that war has no beginning and no end. I want to read a couple of poems about my mom and a couple of poems about my dad. The first poem is called My Mother Was 19, and it's about the day the Germans came to her farm in eastern Poland. Soldiers from nowhere came to my mother's farm, killed her sister's baby with their shoes, shot my grandmother too. One time in the neck, then for kicks, they shot her in the face lots of times. They saw my mother. They didn't care she was a virgin dressed in a blue dress with tiny white flowers. They raped her so she couldn't stand up, couldn't sit down, couldn't talk. They broke her teeth when they shoved her dress into her mouth. If they had had a camera, they would have taken a picture of her and sent it to her. That's the kind of men they were. Years after the war, this is what my mother told me about all of this. She says, God doesn't give you any favors. He doesn't say, now you've seen this bad thing, but tomorrow you'll see a good thing, and when you see it, you'll be smiling. That's just bullshit. My mother, because of her experiences in the war, she just lost faith in everything. She lost faith in men. She lost faith in governments. She lost faith in God. She felt everything around her was worthless. My mother arrived in Germany at a slave labor camp late in the year, and it was a time when they were having a beet harvest, and so they took her and the other girls off of their trucks and just sent them out into the fields to dig up beets. And my mother talked about this a lot. I wrote a poem about it called "The Beets." My mother tells me of the beets she dug up in Germany. They were endless, redder than roses gone bad in an early frost, redder than a grown man's kidney or heart. The first beet she remembers, she was alone in the field, alone without her father or mother near, no sister even. They were all dead, left behind in Poland. The ground was wet and cold, but not soft. It was never soft. My mother ate the raw beet, even though she knew they would beat her. She says sometimes she pretended she was deaf, stupid, crippled, or diseased with typhus or cholera, even with what the children called the French disease, anything to avoid the slap, the whip across her back, the leather fist in her face above her eye. If my mother could have given them her breasts to suck, her womb to penetrate, she would have, just so they would not kill her the way they killed her sister and her mother and the baby. My mother wonders, what was her reward for living through all of this? It was not love or money. My mother wonders if God will remember her labors. She wonders if there is a God. I'm going to read two poems about my dad. When my dad couldn't stop talking about the war. My mother almost never talked about the war, but my dad couldn't stop talking about it. From the time I was 5 and 6 years old, he would be sitting at a table with me, telling me stories about the experiences he had. One of the things he liked talking about was the fact that when he was finally liberated by the Allies, he weighed 76 pounds. And I remember asking him why he weighed 76 pounds. And he said they never gave him any food, or they gave him so little food. So I asked my dad what he ate in the camps, and it became a poem called "What My Father Ate." My father ate what he couldn't eat, what his mother taught him not to. He ate brown grass, small chips of wood, the dirt beneath his gray-dark fingernails. He ate the leaves off trees. He ate bark. He ate the flies that tormented the mules working in the fields. He ate what would kill a man in the normal course of his life. Leather buttons, cloth caps, anything small enough to get into his mouth. My father ate roots. He ate newspapers. In his slow, clumsy hunger, he did what the birds did. He picked for oats or corn or any kind of seed left in the dry shit by the cows. And when there was nothing to eat, he would search the ground for pebbles, and they would loosen his saliva, and he would swallow that. And all of the other men around him did the same. When my father was dying, he was dying of cancer in 1997, and he was on a lot of medication. And even with this medication, he couldn't stop talking about his experiences. And one of the things he talked a lot about was seeing his friends in the camps die. I wrote a poem about it. It's called "What My Father Knows About Killing." My father knew men and animals did not die the same way. A man would kill a horse or a cow or a pig with respect that he'd never show a man. Killing a pig, a man would steady it, prepare it for that single killing blow, work to make its suffering quick, if not instant. A poised hammer ready to strike down in such a way that the pig wouldn't see it or hear it, would barely feel it on the back of its head in that one sure spot that would end it before it knew it. My father knew that this wasn't the way men killed each other. He had seen his friends crucified and hung, castrated and frozen to death. He had seen women raped and beaten and shot, their breasts torn apart by bayonets, their babies thrown and scattered in the air like sand. My father knew that suffering was the sauce we reserve for men and women. Just one more. And this is a prose piece, and it's based on a story my father told me about how he met my mother. Uh, my father, toward the end of the war, was in Buchenwald, and they sent a lot of the people, a lot of the prisoners in Buchenwald, on death marches. And my father met my mother on one of these death marches. He passed by a slave labor camp where she was. The piece is called "My Father Tells Me How He Met My Mother." It's in my father's voice. We came upon a small slave camp in the woods, just 3 or 4 buildings, a fence of barbed wire, a closed gate. Some of us were dying, and we fell to our knees right there. Others kept walking and stumbling toward that gate. There was no one around, no German guards, no soldiers. They must have run away because they thought the war was over and the Americans were coming. There were no prisoners either that we could see in the barracks beyond the fence. We thought that maybe the ones who had been there had been taken like us on a death march. It was so quiet. One of the men with me, a Frenchman, he stepped up to the gate and he shouted, "Hello." That's all he said. He said it in German first and then in French, but no one answered. It sounded funny in French. Bonjour, bonjour. An army truck stood in front of one of the barracks buildings, and I thought I saw some movement there. Even with my one good eye, I could see it. Someone moving near the back of the truck. I pointed this out to the Frenchman, and he saw it too. And we both shouted, him in French and me in Polish. I shouted, "Dzień dobry, dzień dobry." I felt foolish saying good day. There had not been a good day for a long, long time. A woman then came out of the barracks. Like us, she was dressed in rags, striped rags, She stumbled to the gate and stopped there. She looked at us, and we looked at her. No one said anything for a long time. I could see she was weak. She held the gate so tightly with her hands so she wouldn't fall down. I couldn't speak. I had not seen a woman for months and had not talked to one for years. A German would kill you for talking to a woman. Then she spoke in Polish. Slowly she said, "Co teraz?" What now? I didn't know what to say. My tongue was like a rock in my mouth. She said it again, "Co teraz?" And I still didn't know what to say, or what would happen, or if the world would end that day or not. I was hungry and spent, and I didn't know anything. I looked at her and felt so weak, felt like I was going to fall and join my brothers dying around me. And your mother pulled the gate open and said, "Proszę wejść, please come in." And I did. Thank you. That's
Thank
it.
you, John, for
Thanks
these
for listening.
deeply touching
you.
words. Our next speaker will be introduced by Dr. Agata Marriott, the president of the Polonia Institute.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Agata Marriott, and I'm a current president of Polonia Institute. I would like to thank all the participants, all the panelists, Mr. Public for technical support, Mr. Gmura for joining us today, and thanks to Chancellery of the Prime Minister of Poland, who funded this project under the program of Polonia and Poles Abroad. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker, Dr. Maria Schonert-Binienda, who is a founding member of Polonia Institute and present chairwoman of the board of directors. Maria is also a co-founder and president of the World Association of Polonia Republic and the founder of Libra Institute. She is a member of the board of World Council of Research on the Polish Diaspora. In the past, she served as vice president of the Polish American Congress in charge of Polish affairs and was a member of the Polish Diaspora Consultative Council of the Marshal of the Senate of the Republic of Poland. Dr. Schonert-Binienda is the author of many books and articles in English and Polish on historical and legal issues, as well as current events concerning Poland and Polonia. She serves as the editor-in-chief of several English language websites concerning matters related to Poland. Dr. Binienda has been also a co-organizer of major conferences on historical and legal matters and international relations. She has delivered speeches and presentations, expert reports, and legal opinions before professional organizations and US authorities, before the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg and the European Union Parliament, as well as Polonia conferences and before the Polish authorities. For decades, Dr. Schonert-Binienda has been fighting for the recognition of the Katyn operation of 1940, misleadingly named as Katyn Forest Massacre, as the crime of all crimes, that is genocide. She has been deeply involved in struggles to recognize the martyrdom of the ethnic Poles during World War II and to reveal the truth about the Smolensk assassination of 2010. For the contribution of the field of equality in historical memory, she was awarded the title of Professor Honoris Causa by the Jagiellonian College in Toruń. Maria, would you please share with us your presentation?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. And also I would like to thank Dr. John Guzłowski for a phenomenal, very moving presentation. This is so important. It is so important important for the Polish Americans, first and foremost, but also for the Western public opinion. Today, I would like to share with you a story of one man during World War II. And for that, I prepared a video presentation, and I will try to start the presentation right now.
In World War II, the case of Józef, in English, Joseph Fiałkowski, Auschwitz prisoner number 3088, presented by Maria Schonert-Nienda, Juris Doctor. Józef Fiałkowski was born in 1911 in Koło, near Poznań. In 1937, he began his study at the University of Warsaw School of Law. As a student, he met in Warsaw a much younger girl named Danuta Karpowicz, and he loved her. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland and began conducting mass extermination of the Polish civilian population all over Poland. The University of Warsaw did not open that year, so Joseph could not continue his education. Despite the barbaric violence around, Joseph and Danuta got married in Warsaw in June of 1940. Less than 2 months after the wedding, Joseph was caught up in the massive sudden roundup while going out in the morning to buy fresh pastry for breakfast. Together with over 1,000 civilian men rounded up that day on the streets of Warsaw by the Germans, Joseph was shipped directly to the Auschwitz death and concentration camp. While passing through the Auschwitz gate, Joseph was heavily beaten and injured his leg. A high-ranking SS man addressed the Warsaw transport. Holding a big whip, he jumped over the turned-up barrel, called for the translator, and shouted, "This is the concentration camp. No one will get out alive from here. You Poles, remember, you don't have your Poland anymore. Your homeland is behind these barbed wires now. For us, the Germans, you are not human beings. You are just mere dunghills. You are the enemies of the Reich. There is no pity for those like you. Forget about your wives, children, and families. You will die here like animals. You have no more than 3 months to live. Understand?" The Warsaw transport that arrived in Auschwitz on August 15, 1940, consisted of 1,153 civilian men caught on the streets of Warsaw and 513 political prisoners from the Warsaw Heavy Security Prison known as Pawiak. The prisoners from Pawiak consisted of political and religious leaders, activists, lawyers, doctors, and officers of the Polish army. Soon after their arrival, a group of older men was selected to push a huge roller, forcing them to level the main square of the camp. A German criminal named Frankenman stood at the shaft of the roller, hitting the swaying man in front of him with a long riding crop. One of the men fell. Frankenman cheered, forcing the others ahead. The man on the ground was slowly pressed down and run over by the roller. For the first anniversary of the German invasion of Poland, the deputy commander announced that from now on, all camp activities should be performed not by walking, but by running. That day, there was no end to the sadistic torment. The prisoners, like animals in training, had been jumping, running, turning around, rolling, and hopping. Some were climbing the trees, while the oppressors were pursuing them with sticks and riding crabs. The deputy commander was walking from one group to another, inciting the oppressors in their rage. People were falling like flies. 7 dozens of heavily beaten bodies had to be removed from the yard after this rage by those who withstood the ordeal. This task had to be performed by running, of course. One day, the black man brought a big blackboard and special forms on which the prisoners could write their first letters home. He then printed the pre-approved text on the blackboard. The text, written in German, was as follows. Dear so-and-so, I want to let you know that I am in the concentration camp Auschwitz. I'm healthy and fine. I hope you are healthy and fine too. In the camp, we have a shop in which we can buy food and cigarettes. The healthy, sick, the dying had the right to write such a letter home. Subsequently, prisoners were allowed to write letters home once a month. The letters had to be written in German and were heavily censored. In her first reply to Joseph, Danuta wrote, My dearest Yuzio, I have just received the first letter from you. We all are very happy that you are in good health. I already wrote to your mother and sister in Koło. I will write to them again today. We all are in good health and miss you very much. I also want to let you know that I am pregnant. Love, Danusia. In May of 1941, Danusia gave birth to a healthy boy and named him Andrew, nicknamed Jędruś. She immediately wrote to Joseph about the birth of his son Andrew. Joseph replied, My dearest wife, thank you so much for your letter. I was awaiting this letter so impatiently and for so long. I'm very happy that you are fine. I cannot even tell you how happy I am that God gave us a big and healthy son. In your next letter, please describe his cradle. You don't realize how much your letters mean to me. I think about you and Jędruś day and night, and I'm still hoping to come home soon. Your letters give me hope and courage. I work every day and I'm well, thank God. In his hands lies everything. Danusia desperately wanted to show her charming Jędruś to his father. Thus, she wrote to the Auschwitz camp commandant asking him for permission to send a photograph of the newly born baby to his father. In August 1941, Joseph was informed that his wife had requested permission to send him a photograph of his newly born son. But through a special order, Hitler personally forbade any pictures in the concentration camps. Thus, on August 31, Joseph wrote, My beloved Danusia, I'm grateful for everything you all have done for me. I have seen your application regarding the photograph, but you may not send any photograph directly to me. I kiss you and my little Jędruś 1,000 times. One day in the fall of 1941, a guard calls Joseph and says, "Come with me." Certain he was going to die that day, Joseph can't believe his eyes when the guard leads him to the elegant building outside the dreadful camp. The Auschwitz camp commandant sits at the desk. Joseph sits down in front of him. The eyes of the two men meet. The commandant watches Joseph intensely. "Your number?" the ruler asks. 3088, Joseph replies in perfect German. "How long have you been here?" "Since August 1940. "Why did you end up here?" From the street roundup. A series of brief questions ends, and the ruler ponders for a while, snapping his fingers against the desk and observing the prisoner with restrained eagerness. "Your wife sent some photographs here," he says. "As you know, we cannot give you these pictures." He stops and looks at Joseph enigmatically. "But I will show them to you," he finishes out slowly. Joseph is in shock. From deep despair, his mind shifts to unbearable joy. But he must not rejoice. There must be a cruel trick in all this. That's right. The sadist will now observe his pain and will relish in his anguish. Oh, no, Joseph clenches his fists. "I'm not going to cry. I won't please you with my pain," he pledges to himself. "Oh God, give me strength for this trial." The ruler takes out a yellowish envelope and slowly pulls out the first picture. In the palm of this barbaric hand, a delicate profile of his heavenly beautiful Danusia, with a little baby in her arms, emerges. Joseph gasps. But the moment is short. The cruel hand pulls back the photograph. Joseph closes his eyes to hold on to the dearest image of Danusia and Jędruś, to write this image into his memory forever. "Here is another one," the ruler says. A plump big baby smiles to Joseph from the fur rug. "Jędruś, my beloved son." Joseph bites his lips, his nails cut into his flesh. The ruler puts the photograph back. "Fritz," he calls. "Hello." The short, fat SS man comes in. "Take his number for quarantine." The master of life and death orders. "Jawohl." Quarantine, quarantine. The word reverberates like thunder in Joseph's battered mind. He sends the commandant an inquiring look. Two pairs of intense blue eyes meet again for a split of a second. In that misty window of time, Joseph catches a faint flicker of an eyelid. 3088, Joseph loudly pronounces his number. Prince writes down the number, and Joseph is out the door. Gradually, he regains his sanity and starts putting chaotic thoughts together. Danusia, more beautiful than ever, and Jędruś, such a darling. Quarantine, quarantine. Here it means only one and only one thing: freedom. Poor and simple, freedom. But he's fearful, entertained this thought so as not to flatter or frighten this miraculous chance to survive the death camp. The next day he writes, "My dearest Danusia, I read 1,000 times your last letter about my son, who can already say tia-tia. When my son calls me, it means I have to go home. For this, I'm always praying to God. I have seen your photograph. You look beautiful. Your husband, Joseph." In January of 1942, Joseph was released from the Auschwitz death and concentration camp. Formally, he was free, that for all practical purposes, he was still on the SS leash. His discharge certificate from the Auschwitz death and concentration camp contained disastrous conditions. Until further notice, you must report to the city police in your place of residence, the instruction reads. An additional typewritten order follows. Report at once to the office of the Security Police and Gestapo in the district of Warsaw, Police Street 25. In other words, Joseph has to report to the Gestapo immediately. As it turns out, Joseph has to report to Gestapo every week indefinitely. Moreover, the Gestapo henchmen expect him to report on his family and friends in order to stay free. He quickly realizes that he is in a deadly trap. In the spring of 1942, he decides to stop reporting to the Gestapo and goes into hiding in the countryside. Less than a year later, Joseph was shot and killed by the Gestapo on the street in the small town of Radzin. His body was not returned to the family. By that time, Danuta was pregnant with her second child. She fought a battle of her life with the Radzin Gestapo to recover the body of her murdered husband and to bury him properly at the Catholic cemetery. This photograph shows Danuta Fijałkowska pregnant with the second child at her husband's grave. 5 months after the Germans murdered Joseph, Danuta gave birth to a little baby girl, Elizabeth. The baby was born in the small town of Międzyrzec in eastern Poland. In the 1944 battle for Warsaw, Danuta's home in the old town in Warsaw was completely destroyed by German tanks and bombs. After the Polish Home Army lost the battle for Warsaw, Germans took over the city. On October 9, 1944, Reichsführer SS Himmler ordered the complete destruction of Warsaw. The order was as follows. This city is to be completely destroyed, must disappear from the face of the earth. Stone upon stone should not remain. All buildings must be demolished down to their foundations. On the 50th anniversary of World War II, the Polish Pope, John Paul II, proclaimed a joint decision of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union from August 1939, which sentenced Poland and other states to death, was not without a precedent. It was the reverberation of what Poland's neighbors from the West and East once decreed at the end of the 18th century and had been patronizing to the onset of the 20th century. In the middle of the 20th century, the same decision of destruction and extermination was made once again. The Pope concludes that a system must be created to ensure that the economic and military supremacy shall never lead to the destruction of others in disregard for human rights. For us, the question remains, was the same decision of destruction and extermination made once again in the 21st century? The story of Danuta, presented in my book, Growing Up Between Katyn and Auschwitz, encapsulates the drama of Poland in World War II. While Danuta's husband was murdered by the Germans, her father was murdered by the Soviets. The utmost pertinent message of John Paul II that addresses the problem of imperial expansion through genocide is printed on the back of this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. We have some questions for you, but maybe we'll ask them at the next presentation. So our next speaker will be introduced by Maya. Let me switch over to her.
Good afternoon. I have the pleasure of presenting Stephen Gilbride. Stephen Gilbride is the son of Richard Gilbride and Bożena Urbanowicz. Bożena's story started in Leonówka, a tiny village in Poland's eastern borderlands in 1934. Bożena co-authored one book on some of her experiences getting through World War II and ultimately authored a book that details the hardships, struggles, and family separation under Nazi Germany's rule and ultimately the reunification of her family in America. Stephen has attended the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin, and while living in Europe for about a decade, made many visits to Poland to visit family and culturally connect. Stephen continues to seek opportunities to carry out the work his mother started in making sure that the truth of the Holocaust and its impacts on the Polish people does not get distorted over time. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. Let me get set up. I have some slides as well. Thank you for the invite. Thank you for the introduction there. I'm actually quite humbled in front of all of you to be able to present my mother's story about surviving the Holocaust as a Polish Catholic in the Eastern Territories of pre-World War II Poland. So the story of my mother, Bożena Urbanowicz-Gilbride, and her family is a firsthand account of the treatment of the Polish population during World War II. The horror inflicted on 6 million of the Jewish faith is something we should never forget. But we should always act to remember the 5 million or more others who suffered only because of their nationality, political affiliations, sexual orientation, any other factors. There's so much that we need to remember from the lessons learned from this, how that got started, and how this is carried forward to the generations after my mom's. What am I doing to help do that? And of course we come back to the German Lutheran pastor, Martin Niemöller, in 46. And I know we've heard this all before, we have, and it's an important message that we carry forward and that it's understood. When his poem about the incremental purging of Nazis' chosen targets, group after group, when he said, first they came for socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I'm not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And it just still gives me goosebumps, just thinking through that, just knowing what a message that is, even for the times that we're in now, and for the generations that, I'm raising 2 kids as well too, and that the things that we should not forget. I'm going to start a little background on my mom's book, and I really want to just spend some time talking about the effort and the research that went into writing the book, because I believe that that's where the next generations and stuff should be learning from as well, is how to do that research and teach themselves things as well too. But my mom never talked to us as kids about her experiences in Poland while we were growing up. And I guess that she did this to give us a chance to grow up without that shadow of the past. Well intended. It wasn't until my late teens that mom would share superficial details with me because I pressed and I asked for more info. I was curious about my heritage and I needed to know. I went to Poland to study in the summer of 1984 in Lublin. So it was still communist Poland at the time. And at that time, of course, the movement with Lech Walesa was underway. So I visited a lot of historic sites. We felt like we were constantly being watched, of course. was quite an experience for me at that age. But the most shocking and lasting images in my mind were those of the Majdanek concentration camp. I was able to visit relatives on their farms and such as well too, relatives that had been relocated to the western side of Poland after the war near Wałbrzych. I was just fascinated discovering my cultural past, but also moved in a different way about how it was marred by such hate and intolerance that just ruled that period and that land. Over the years, I would try to find opportunities, the most opportune times that I could, to ask my mom questions and get her to tell me more details about her experiences in Poland. Mom was finally opening up and sharing much more details of her experiences with me and others by the 1990s, late 90s. And that was very beneficial for me, I think, to truly understand all of this. And it's just captured me. And I want to make sure I'm bringing this forward to next generation and carrying out what she started. And Mom co-wrote her first book, as was mentioned earlier, Children of Terror with Inga Auerbacher. And they did a lot of speaking to elementary and high school students. And you can see some picture there that we're showing. And the book was not the Children of Terror wasn't a full accounting, okay, of my mom's experiences and her family's experiences and that path that occurred from Leonovka, Poland, to the USA during World War II. Right? So Mom was determined to write a second book detailing the specifics of her family's experiences. So while writing the second book, waiting for Mama, my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. So this made her more ambitious and in a way hasty to have the book published and released in 2017. When I read the book, I said to Mom that it wasn't complete. Very honest with her. And I said there was much more that she had shared with me over the years. And readers needed to understand more about the context, much like how she would do in her speaking engagements. Well, Mom's cancer was showing some signs of remission at a point there, which was incredible for someone of her age, pancreatic cancer, to show any remission at that point, as many of us know. And I offered to help add more to the book and work with her, and that we would release a second edition. So this collaboration with my mom really, gave me an opportunity, maybe a selfish opportunity, to spend more time with her and learn more, as much as I possibly could, about those experiences that she had. And we shared a passion in the research of it. And I think we shared a passion too about wanting to make this available for future generations. So the second edition was published just before my mom's passing in March of 2020. But I do want to cover some of the things about the research that goes into this, because I think it's important that we don't just teach people about what happened here, but we teach them how to research it and find out about their own connections to it as well. I think it's very important to bring the reality of it all to you. So I quickly found myself really engaged in everything here. The more I read, the more I could feel the time and place that my mom was in when all this happened. And being a director with the Office of the Inspector General at the Library of Congress gave me some mysteriously timely proximity and access to information. Just everything was just clicked on its own here in a sense. The Library of Congress is available publicly to everybody. So this was not an extra benefit or something that is not available to the public. It's there for everybody. But I had all this. The benefit for me was within walking distance of my desk at the office. I could go to the reading rooms. I could go to the research rooms on the evenings and weekends and put that to good use. And I came across references to the National Archives as well, which just has troves of online data available to the public. And it helped by providing specific support and filling in some blanks, to the dates and the events as we were researching and adding to my mom's book on that second edition. And for me, probably one of the biggest first things that I wanted to know about was to understand that village that my mother grew up in. Where specifically was it? How large was it? My mother had told me it was near a river. She thought it was the Bug River, but wasn't sure. Leonovka wasn't on any current maps that I've been looking at in the past and up to that point. And Mom said she remembered they would go to the nearest, largest town of Tuchin. So between these clues and about the river and the city, I had a general idea. I used Google Maps to get a GPS coordinate of where we believe that was Leonovka was. I actually gave that to the librarian, the research librarian in the maps division at the Library of Congress. And this is the way it works for anybody. You might have to register as a researcher, that's free. But I just gave those GPS coordinates and I said, I'm looking for any maps, dated between the period 1938 to 1942. And in about a week, I got a phone call from the maps division, from the librarian there, and ready for viewing.
Cool.
So I had maps that the Army had seized as they were liberating throughout Europe, but in Poland as well too. But all these troves of information were just there, and they're there for anybody who's just stunning to walk in there and have these huge maps. And if you're there in person, you'll get the free scanning, so you could take them away as digital items with you. And the quality was excellent. So I had found the precise location of Leonovka. There's a little red dot there. I hope you all can see it, and where that is, and it lined up with everything that we had heard, and everything that Mom remembered as well too. So now it was becoming very real for me to understand that proximity. But even more, my mom had located a book and some other research that was done by other folks that actually identified the residences of Leonovka, of the village. And we thought, this is amazing, and Mom would remember these names, as we talked about it, such. So anyway, it was becoming quite real. There in number 21 was my grandfather, Victor Uvanovas, his wife was Yanina, and the 4 children. So everything is now really starting to make a great, picture in my head of where my heritage was coming from. Now, this was amazing. The Polish declarations of 1926, they are at the Library of Congress. There is a tremendous set of volumes of books. If you're not familiar with this, hopefully you're going to be a little amazed right now. I hope as much as I was. They're called the Polish Declarations of Admiration and Friendship for the United States in 1926 on the occasion of the 150th anniversary of the U.S. independence. And there's some really beautiful forwards in here in the volumes and everything, thanking America for the support and things like that. Now, what the Polish government had done was had sent these sheets around to a lot of the, mostly through civic offices, but a lot of the schools as well. Elementary, high schools, everything. Basically, for it all appearances that they got a signature from everybody in the country at the time. It's an absolutely amazing document. And when we open this up and I find what you're looking at right now, Leonovka, and I shared this with my mom, it was almost tears for her, because you can kind of make out, you know, and I apologize, you know, the images here, but you can see the Umanovich name and everything in there. Mom could look and say, that's my aunt. You know, I know these people. I know these people. And, you know, this really is, it gives me goosebumps right now just to share this with you. It's just, it just really puts the human perspective in, you know, into everything here. So I'll go ahead and provide a little bit more here about the documents that we were able to find, which was the manifest listing the arrival of my mother and her family, minus my mom's mom, my grandmother, Yanina, to the port of New York. And this was just done going through microfiche, you know, knowing that we had an idea of the date, the month, actually, you know, when it started, of the arrival. And then finding the article you can see in the upper left was there announcing that the ship had arrived with 98 refugee children. And the National Archives had the manifest for the alien passenger manifest, as you can see on the bottom. And right there, you know, there's my grandfather, there's my mother, and her siblings, all listed in there. You know? So, yeah, there's a great reality about all of this that was able to be pieced together with the supporting documents and such. And a lot of this went into the second edition. And again, you know, it brought me closer to the reality of it. Certainly brought me closer to my mom during that period as well, too. I would encourage everybody, you know, to really look at their heritage and look at the materials available through the research. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the book now specifically. Waiting for Mama tells the story of Bożena, my mom, as a child in a family of 4 children. She was caught between the Soviets and Germany and the Eastern Poland, but you know, in there's also the mix of the UPA, which was the Ukrainian army faction here, radical. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that. And that was a faction that was led by Stefan Bandera, and the guy was evil. The UPA was evil. They rained hell over the regions of eastern Galicia and Volhynia. They did the dirty work. They did a lot of the work for the Soviets and the Germans, to be honest, just seeking to have their own self-rule, you know, in hopes of being rewarded something for that. So there were, in some ways, 3 fronts there: the Soviets, the German, UPA, that terrorized those villages. And that was happening to my mom when she was in the ages of 5 through 9. It's important to understand that this region was not just suffering Soviet German atrocities, you know, that were waiting for them to come across, and you know, the different lines and battle lines and everything. There was hell being rained from within. What I want to do is just share a little bit about that too, about what they had to live with, you know, even within the boundaries before the East and West, you know, the Germans and the Soviets came in. And I'm just going to give you a little bit out of Wikipedia, which I don't like quoting, but I will. When they talked about the UPA, they say the ethnic cleansing was a Ukrainian attempt to prevent post-war Polish state from asserting its sovereignty over Ukrainian majority areas that had been part of the pre-war Polish state. The decision to force the Polish population to leave the areas considered by the Banderite faction of the organization, the UPA, took place at a meeting of military referents in the autumn of 1942. It was planned to liquidate the leaders of the Polish community and those who would resist. Local UPA commanders in Volhynia, joining the armed uprising against the Germans, began attacking the Polish population, carrying out massacres in many villages. Encountering resistance, UPA commander in Volhynia Klimtsevor issued an order in June of 43 for the general physical liquidation of the entire Polish population. The largest wave of attacks took place in July and August of 43. The assaults continued until 44, when the Red Army arrived in Volhynia, and the Polish underground, which had hitherto organized self-defense, formed the 27th AK Infantry Division, but about 50 to 60,000 Poles died as a result of that genocide. Those are the numbers that we have there. Following, for my family, following a hasty fleeing from Leonovka and being captured by German forces, my mom's family is forced to work for the Germans in a labor camp in Chemnitz. Just to get on with more about what's in the book there. It was there in Chemnitz that Bożena's mother, Janina, my grandmother, was arrested by the Germans on charges resulting from a mix-up, and my grandmother was separated from the family. And Bożena is about 10 years old at the time. It's late 1944, and she's thinking that's the last time she's going to see her mother. So Chemnitz contained factories that produced military hardware, and the Flossenburg forced labor camp was there, which was for Astrowerk AG. By 1945, Chemnitz is being bombed routinely under something called Operation Thunderclap. So, again, here you have, 10 years old and such. You've been purged from your home, the farm, the village, all these things that are so real. You've been purged from there. Your mother's been separated and taken by these forces, and now you're being subjected to bombing. You really have to think this is quite the terror, that nobody should have to go through. So at this time, Janina, my grandmother, was in other camps while the family was still at the factory camp, labor camp in Chemnitz, when liberation begins. For my mom, her father, and the siblings, the liberation came from the Americans. For Janina, my grandmother, if you can call it liberation, it was from the Soviets. Basically, fast forwarding a little bit, my grandfather, my mother, in the book you'll read that they were moved to a displaced persons camp in Karlsruhe, Germany. But even from there, my grandfather continued to make inquiries. There's an inquiry card there on the right-hand side. So much like you see, of course, even unfortunately after like 9/11 and such, there were things set up to help find people, or after natural disasters. Of course, this was going on in post-war times here, and they had, what was it, the UNRRA? If anybody can help me with that, I'm going from memory. That did a lot of the work as well too, to try and get families back together. And you can see an inquiry card here again. That was compliments of the National Archives, available to anybody who's willing to do the searching. So my grandfather, Bożena, and the family there, they did not want to go back to Poland under the rule of the Soviets. And Bożena's life has changed forever when the family is finally approved to leave the displaced persons camp in Germany and set sail for America after waiting for sponsorship papers and things to be processed. But I do want to just share that one moment of lightheartedness that came out of some of the speaking time that I had with my mom going through these things, if I could use that word, lightheartedness. But my mom shared with me about the trip over on the ship. I always asked a lot of questions when she told me about an event to try and get her memory going for details and such. And I said, what did you do on the ship every day? And I said, what did you eat? And that ship ride, there wasn't much detail available except when I asked about the food. And then she said it seemed like it was hot dogs every day that they had fed her on the ship over. arriving to America. And of course, that seemed fine, that we're getting fed. But years later, my mother was telling her father, my grandfather, who we call Papuga, she told him that she had met an Irishman who had been in the Navy, and they would be getting married. My grandfather said to my mom, "Why do you want to marry him? All they do is eat hot dogs." We thought that was kind of lighthearted. Maybe you had to be there. So just in wrapping up, again, I'd be humbled. I'd be pleased if you were to read the book, Waiting for Mama. I think there's a lot in there. I think it's definitely in my mom's wishes and intentions. It's still targeted towards that younger reading group, and to get them motivated into learning more about this time and understanding what it meant, what was the real impact, the human impact. It's not just a story, it's real. It touched a lot of people, and we need to learn from that, and do what we can before these stories are forgotten or God forbid, banned. Who knows what's going to happen. But as I said, there's more story, a lot more to the story in the book. You can anticipate that Božena does not give up on her mama, Janina, but not to give away everything in the book, because I would like y'all to read it and hopefully provide some comments on it as well too. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I hope that people will start reading the books. And this is the end of our presentation. We do have a few questions. Actually, these questions are for Dr. Schonert, so let me read them and let her answer them. And then after that, if anybody of our panelists would like to say something, yes, absolutely, we'll open the floor. But after Dr. Schonert answers the questions, okay? So the questions are, the first question, how frequent were the street roundups and whether they occurred only in Warsaw or throughout the occupied Poland? And maybe I already said the second question. The second is, why was Joseph's body not returned to the family? Okay, so this is for Maria.
Okay.
Hold on now.
Maybe I start with the second. Yes.
Yes, you're on.
Okay, I will start with the second question. When Joseph was murdered, the Germans did not return the body to the family, and this is the practice. I think quite popular in Europe, that if you want to kill the opponent, you also want to kill the memory of that opponent, and to make sure that that opponent is not become a symbol of martyrdom. So both the Germans and the Soviets were killing the Polish people and hiding their bodies from the families and from the Polish people, this practice really added a tremendous suffering to the families. And in my book, I describe the struggle of Danuta to find the body of her husband, so that her children can have at least the grave of their father. So I think this is a very important issue, and should be also considered in the report on the losses, because the human suffering is really impossible to measure. But this is one of those examples how to increase the suffering of your opponent. So that's one question. And the second is the street roundups. And that again is an important issue for the report on war losses, because the roundups were taking place all over Poland, and they were frequent. They were frequent in Warsaw, in Krakow, and they were, for example, frequent on the trains in front of the schools. For example, there were instances when children were leaving school and the Gestapo would round them up, all of them, and ship them to Germany, almost in front of the desperate parents. So this kind of experience is really hard to relate to today, but it did happen in Poland, and those street roundups were frequent, but also the street executions were frequent in Warsaw specifically. So I don't know why those stories are not better known to the international community, because we really have to know about those practices to condemn them and to make sure they never happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. This concludes our webinar. I wanted to thank our guests, the panelists, the attendees, and the technical team. I hope that this webinar will motivate our viewers to read the books and spread the information about the ethnic Polish victims of Nazi Germany in World War II. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.